Before she even learned how to sign her name in cursive, before she could fully understand why her heart raced when someone said her name in front of a crowd, before she ever raised her hand to disagree or stayed behind after class to question a grade, someone had already labeled her. Not brilliant, not curious, not brave, but aggressive. It didn't come from a sudden outburst, because there was none. It didn't come from a fight, because she had never laid a hand on anyone. It came from something far simpler, far quieter, a refusal to shrink. She didn't look away when spoken to. She didn't laugh when jokes didn't feel funny. She didn't apologize for standing where she stood. And in a school where compliance was mistaken for character, that was enough to make her a threat. The first time it happened, she was sitting on the reading rug in a circle of classmates, legs crossed, hands in her lap. The teacher, Ms. Taylor, was assigning roles for a group presentation on Harriet Tubman, and when it came time to assign the narrator, the student who would guide the audience through the entire project, her hand shot up, just slightly quicker than the others. Ms. Taylor didn't even look in her direction. She called on Jason, who had misread 3 passages earlier that day, who stumbled over the word abolitionist during warm-ups and laughed it off with the ease of someone who had never been told that his voice was too loud for learning. Still, she stayed quiet, until recess, when Jason bragged about being chosen, even though, in his words, that Harriet lady was just some runaway. She corrected him, calmly, clearly, confidently, and that was the moment Jason told her, half joking but loud enough for the teacher to hear. Why do you always gotta act like you're in charge? It was meant to sting. It was also meant to plant a seed. That afternoon, her mother received a call. Your daughter's been very assertive lately. Sometimes it comes off as oppositional. Oppositional. That word would follow her like a shadow through every grade level. It was never written in red ink. It was never screamed at her in hallways. But it was whispered during parent-teacher conferences, mentioned in staff emails, slid quietly between the lines of report cards. And she, being only 8, didn't know what oppositional meant, so she looked it up. The dictionary in her living room, thick and tattered from years of hand-me-down reading, offered this. Oppositional, resisting control or authority. She read it again, then again. And something inside her shifted, not out of pride, not out of rebellion, but confusion, because she had never resisted. She had only existed, and somehow, in that school, in that system, just existing with her shoulders upright and her voice clear was already too much. She began to feel it every day, in the way Ms. Taylor's eyes narrowed just a bit when she asked a question, in how group assignments were restructured, so that she was always the note-taker, never the leader, in the way the boys in her class would mimic her cadence when she read aloud, calling her little lawyer in the halls, not because they admired her articulation, but because they found it unnatural on someone who looked like her. Her mother tried to fight it, tried to set up meetings, ask for observations, bring in outside support, but the moment her mother raised her own voice, just once in frustration, she too was labeled confrontational, as if it were genetic. So the girl began to shrink, not in height or presence, but in faith. She stopped volunteering to read. She started second-guessing every sentence before she said it. She smiled more, even when she didn't mean it. And when Ms. Taylor told her one day, "I'm proud of how you're learning to manage your tone," she nodded. But inside, something broke, because she wasn't managing a tone. She was burying a voice. It happened on a Tuesday, not a special one, not a holiday. Just one of those regular school days when the hallway smells faintly of pencil shavings and damp jackets, and the teachers seemed just a little more tired than usual. She hadn't spoken all morning, not because she was upset, but because she'd learned that silence was safer. When you're quiet, they can't call your tone disrespectful. When you don't answer quickly, they can't say you were trying to sound smart. When you stay small, you don't get blamed for taking up too much space. But even that day, her best wasn't enough. Ms. Taylor was passing back the math quizzes. A simple fractions test, the kind she usually did well on. But when the paper landed on her desk, it had a big red C on top and a note scribbled in the margin. "See me after class. Sloppy work." She stared at it for a full minute. Not because she didn't understand, but because she did. Every answer was there, neatly written, numbers lined up. She could point to the mistake. One misplaced decimal on the last question. A careless slip, yes, but not worth the comment. Not when she'd seen other students, boys, turn in entire blank pages and get, at worst, a "let's try again." Still, she said nothing. Just folded the paper once, then twice, then slid it quietly into her backpack. But something shifted during lunch. Her friend Naomi was crying, softly, face hidden in her tray. Another girl had teased her about the way she said "library," dragging the word into a messy mimic of her mother's Caribbean accent. And when Naomi spoke up, when she asked the teacher for help, the response was calm but firm. "Just ignore it. Don't make it bigger than it is." That phrase, that cursed phrase, it rang in her head like a fire bell. Don't make it bigger than it is. As if they were always the ones deciding how big things were allowed to feel. As if their embarrassment always outweighed your pain. As if silence wasn't just expected, but demanded. So when the afternoon group project started, and the same two boys who always talked over her began mocking Naomi under their breath again, she didn't raise her hand. She raised her voice. "Can you just stop talking like that? She didn't do anything to you. It wasn't loud, it wasn't rude, but it was clear, unapologetic, directed, and in that classroom, that was enough." The room froze. Ms. Taylor looked up from her desk. The boys feigned confusion. Naomi stayed quiet, and the girl, whose heart was pounding in her ears, was met not with understanding, but with a single clipped command. "Step outside." No questions, no context, just removal. In the hallway, as she stood alone next to a row of faded locker doors, she felt the heat rising up her neck. Not from shame, from knowing, deeply, bitterly, that she had done what they told her to do. She'd spoken clearly, defended someone, used her voice, respectfully, and still, they made her the problem. That was the moment something broke, but not the kind they could punish. It was a fracture they couldn't see. The kind that happens when a child realizes the rules aren't made for her. They're made to manage her. And from that day on, she stopped trying to follow the script. She wasn't about to yell, not yet, but she was done whispering. After that day in the hallway, she didn't get into trouble. Not officially. No suspension, no write-up, no call home. But something colder took its place, something harder to fight. Ms. Taylor's smiles became thinner. Her name wasn't called on in discussions as often. In group work, she was assigned roles that didn't require speaking. And every time a disagreement arose, even small ones about pencils or who went first, someone would glance at her like they were waiting for her to erupt. She began to notice how quickly the word attitude showed up when she talked. How often her facial expressions were questioned. "Are you rolling your eyes at me?" How other students could groan, sigh, push back, and no one flinched. But her. Her silence was brooding. Her tone, defensive. Her opinions, hostile. She wasn't seen as a child anymore. She was now a problem to be managed. One day, during a class on conflict resolution, the school counselor came in with printed worksheets and a bright smile. She wore a shirt that read, "Be kind always." They were told to act out skits, what to do when someone is mean, how to handle disagreements with calm voices and positive words. And when the counselor asked for volunteers to act out a scene, she raised her hand, not to perform, to ask a question. "What if someone calls you aggressive before you've even said anything?" The room went quiet. The counselor blinked. Ms. Taylor shifted in her chair. And then came the answer that felt like a door closing. "That's why it's important to be extra careful with our energy." Extra careful. The message was clear. You are the threat. You must contain yourself, even when you're not the problem, especially when you're not. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with her mom, tracing the edge of her cup with her finger. Her little brother sat beside her, chattering about his art class. He got to paint whatever he wanted that day. No rules, no grades, just color. She didn't say much, just one sentence. I think they expect me to fail quietly. Her mom didn't answer right away. She just reached over and took her hand. Have you ever felt like you were being punished for who you hadn't even become yet? The following week, during a school assembly, all students were asked to stand and recite the school's behavioral honor code. A tradition, a chant of sorts, something about respect, responsibility, and representing our community with grace. It was the kind of scripted moment she used to follow without question. You stand, you speak, you sit. But that day, something inside her stalled. Maybe it was the counselor's shirt from before. Maybe it was the way a boy in her class, the same one who mimicked her voice last month, was now reading the pledge without irony. Maybe it was the irony itself. So when the line came, "I will always use calm words and actions to create peace," she stayed silent. She didn't look away. She didn't slouch. She didn't disrupt. She simply didn't lie. Ms. Taylor saw it. Of course she did. Her eyebrows raised, sharp and immediate. After the assembly, the teacher called her aside with a sugary firmness that always meant trouble. "Why didn't you say the pledge today?" She hesitated for a second, then answered, not with anger, not with sarcasm, but with something that tasted like freedom. "Because I don't feel like it applies to me the same way it does to them." Silence. Ms. Taylor didn't know what to say. She clearly hadn't planned for honesty. Later that afternoon in the staff lounge, her name would come up again. She's getting too bold. Always has something to say. Not everything's about race, you know. They'd talk about her like she was an idea, not a person, like a case study they couldn't quite close. But what they couldn't see, what they never could, was the small victory that bloomed quietly inside her. For the first time, she didn't try to explain herself to make someone else comfortable. She didn't try to soften her thoughts to fit someone else's story. She just stood in her own truth, and that, for a black girl in a white space, is its own kind of revolution. The first time her name appeared in the school newspaper, it wasn't for an award or a spotlight feature. It was a single sentence, buried in a column about the diverse voices of the school's upcoming student panel on leadership and community. Her mother had signed the permission slip without asking much. It sounded like an honor, an opportunity, a chance to be heard. But when she walked into the auditorium that day, she immediately knew what it really was. There were 5 students on stage. 4 of them wore blazers. 3 of them had been student council members since the 5th grade. All of them had been invited because they were the safe kind of outspoken. The kind that spoke when spoken to. The kind that offered neat answers to messy problems. And then there was her. No prepared remarks. No guiding questions sent in advance. Just a last-minute invitation, like a quota to be filled. Still, she sat down. Not because she felt welcome, but because she was tired of being invisible. When it was finally her turn to speak, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't clear her throat for attention. She simply leaned into the mic and said, "Sometimes, I feel like we're only allowed to talk about diversity once it's already polished and polite. But most of us live it every day in ways that don't look like posters." There was a pause, then a few awkward coughs. The counselor forced a smile. Someone clapped, just one person, near the back. Then silence again. That night, she didn't sleep. She kept replaying the scene in her head, wondering if she'd said too much or not enough, wondering if they'd take her off the panel, wondering if Ms. Taylor would mention it in class the next morning. But when she arrived at school, something unexpected happened. Naomi found her before first period, slid a folded piece of paper into her hand. It was a note, handwritten, short, and shakily penned. "You said what I never could. Thank you." And that was the moment she realized her story was never just hers. Every word she had spoken was holding up the voices of others who had learned to lower their heads, to raise their hands only halfway, to shrink before they were asked to. The letter didn't come from her teacher this time. It came sealed in a white envelope, stamped with the school's crest, handed to her at the end of the day by the front office secretary with the same tone she used to announce tardies and lost lunch cards. Inside was a note from the principal. Formal. Cold. Written like a formality, but reading like a threat. We appreciate your willingness to participate in school activities. However, we ask that students refrain from expressing personal views in a manner that may be perceived as divisive. No reference to what she had said. No mention of who was offended. Just a quiet attempt to remind her of her place. She took it home, showed it to her mother, and waited. Not for comfort. For confirmation. Her mother read the letter twice, then folded it slowly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gasp. She just said, "So now the truth is a disruption." The next morning she walked into school a little differently. She wasn't angry, not yet, but she was alert, focused, aware in a way she hadn't been before. In class, every time someone made a joke under their breath, she saw which teachers pretended not to hear. Every time she asked a question, she saw how carefully her tone was weighed before her words were even answered. Every time another black student went ignored, interrupted, or talked down to, she marked it, like etches in a wall. She wasn't collecting grudges. She was building evidence. Then came the weekly class discussion. A required assignment. Students were to debate whether school uniforms helped create equality among students. One of the boys, loud and confident, argued that uniforms remove identity problems and help keep everyone on the same level. And when she raised her hand, calmly, deliberately, Ms. Taylor hesitated before calling on her. But she did. Uniforms might make people look the same, but they don't change how we're treated. There was no applause, there was no outrage, just stillness. And that stillness was louder than any argument she could have made. It started with a cough. A soft, awkward cough from Naomi, 2 rows back, after a substitute teacher mispronounced her name for the 3rd time in 1 hour. Normally, she'd let it slide, laugh it off, shrink a little smaller. But this time, after the 3rd butchered syllable and the absent apology, she cleared her throat louder and said, "It's actually pronounced Naomi." The room froze for half a second, and then nothing. The substitute nodded, corrected himself, moved on. It was the kind of moment that most wouldn't notice. But she did. She looked at Naomi, and Naomi looked back. And in that glance, something passed between them. Something quiet, but unshakable. The kind of power that comes from being seen. By Friday, other ripples began to form. Another girl refused to switch out of her assigned seat, just because the teacher assumed she'd be a distraction. A boy in gym class asked, politely but directly, why only certain students were ever called leaders. A group of students asked if the school's Black History Month display could include more than just Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. These weren't protests. They weren't rebellions. They were questions, refusals, tiny fractures in the script. And slowly it became clear that something was happening. Not because the teachers talked about it, but because they didn't. The air in the hallways began to shift. Some adults smiled tighter. Others avoided eye contact. One teacher, who'd always been warm, stopped asking how she was doing altogether. And through it all, she walked a little straighter. Not because she wanted to lead, but because she knew others were watching to see if it was safe to follow. The invitation came on a Thursday. A printed slip, quietly placed on her desk during homeroom. No eye contact, no explanation, just 4 words typed in bold across the top. Administrative review meeting, required. She didn't ask questions. She knew what it was. The kind of meeting that wasn't really a meeting, more like a soft warning wrapped in polite language and fluorescent lighting. A room with too many adults and not enough chairs. A table where decisions were made long before the student entered. When she walked in, the principal sat at the head of the table, flanked by Ms. Taylor and the school counselor. Her mother was there too, straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, jaw set. The principal began with pleasantries. how much they appreciated her passion, her engagement, her eagerness to be heard. Then, like a practiced script, the conversation turned, "We just want to ensure that your behavior continues to support a positive learning environment for everyone." Everyone? A word that always meant everyone but her. They brought up her comments during class discussions. They referenced the panel. They said words like tone and climate and impact. But never once did they mention her by name when speaking of leadership. Never once did they use the word fairness. Never once did they say she was wrong, just that she was too much. And when the principal paused, waiting for her to speak, she didn't apologize. She didn't nod. She didn't flinch. She looked at each of them, one by one, and said, "You keep telling me how to be heard, but no one's ever asked what I've been trying to say." The room went still. Ms. Taylor adjusted her pen. The counselor blinked. Her mother, still silent, smiled barely. She left the meeting with no punishment, no suspension, no written consequence. But in the hallway, as she walked past other classrooms, she knew something had changed. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about a system that had grown used to whispers and didn't know what to do when someone finally spoke with clarity. And she wasn't going back to silence. Not now, not ever. It started with a screenshot. Just a blurry photo someone had taken during the panel weeks ago, where she sat at the edge of the stage, microphone in hand, brow furrowed, eyes unwavering. Someone posted it online with the caption, "When the youngest voice in the room says the thing no one else dared to." No tags, no context. But by morning, it had already been shared dozens of times. Mostly by students, then by a few parents, then by someone who ran a local youth advocacy page. And suddenly, something shifted. Other students, some she'd never even spoken to, began to nod at her in the halls. A parent she didn't recognize approached her mother at the grocery store and said, "Your daughter. She reminds me of me at her age. I just didn't have the words." An older student, one who had been suspended last semester for disruptive behavior, sent her a message. "They tried to make me quiet too. Keep going." Her name wasn't famous. She wasn't trending, but people were watching, and that changed everything. The school didn't say anything directly, but suddenly new posters went up. Diversity, inclusion, unity. A new section appeared in the morning announcements about celebrating student voices. The next week, the principal sent an email inviting all students to submit feedback on school climate. It all sounded good, polished, inclusive, but she could feel the edge beneath the smile. None of it came with accountability. None of it named what had happened. None of it asked how they made a child feel like her voice was dangerous. And still, she stood taller, not because she wanted attention, not because she felt powerful, but because her silence had once made her feel alone. Now her voice made others feel seen. This wasn't about a speech or a classroom. It was about not folding, especially when the world prefers you bent. It came wrapped in a smile. After weeks of tension, silence, and side glances, the principal called her in again. This time, not to the conference room, not in front of a panel, but to his office. Alone. Just him and her. The air smelled like citrus cleaner and old carpet. The windows were cracked open just enough to hear the distant sound of recess, children laughing, whistling, breathing freely. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. Then came the words, "I just wanted to touch base. There's been a lot of noise lately, but I think we all want the same thing, harmony, respect, a chance to move forward." He smiled again, then leaned in. "You're very smart, very passionate, and we want to support that. But you have to understand, tone matters, timing matters, intentions can be misread." She didn't speak, not yet. He continued, "You're not in trouble, of course not. But I hope you can see how things may have come across. To some people, maybe even to yourself." It wasn't an apology. It was a realignment, a reframing of events where no one had done anything wrong, except maybe her, by being too visible. She studied his face, calm, rehearsed, leaning on years of practiced diplomacy. The kind of man who handled problems by pretending they were misunderstandings. The kind who offered peace without ever admitting to war. And then she said, "You want me to shrink again?" He blinked, caught off guard. "I'm just saying, no. You're saying you want the performance of resolution, without the discomfort of truth." He exhaled sharply, tried to smile, but the edges of his mouth didn't quite cooperate. "We just want what's best for all students. Then stop asking some of us to carry more silence than others." She stood up, thanked him for his time, walked out, not angry, not shaken, just done with being small. It was during a routine reading period, one of those quiet hours after lunch when the lights were dimmed just enough, and the hum of the overhead projector was the loudest sound in the room. She sat near the back, eyes on a page she wasn't reading, thoughts drifting somewhere between yesterday's hallway glances and tomorrow's homework. Then came the whisper, a small voice from the desk beside hers, barely audible, dry, nervous. "Do you think it's okay if I don't want to read out loud?" She turned her head. It was Elijah, new student, short, soft-spoken, hair always neatly braided, eyes always somewhere near the floor. She hadn't spoken much to him, not because she didn't care, but because she knew what that kind of quiet meant. It wasn't shyness, it was self-preservation. She leaned in, careful not to scare him off. "Did someone ask you to?" He nodded, eyes flicking toward the teacher, who was making her way down the row, clipboard in hand. "She always skips me. But today she said it's my turn." There was no malice in his voice, no rebellion, just fear. The kind you learn young, fear of being seen only to be misunderstood. And suddenly she was 8 years old again, sitting on the reading rug, raising her hand, just a little too fast, being told later she was too intense. She remembered the sting, the confusion, the shame of being called loud when all she did was speak clearly. So when the teacher reached Elijah's desk and asked, "Ready to read, sweetheart?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. That pause, just long enough to become a problem. She didn't wait. "I'll go for him." The teacher blinked. He will, when it feels like a choice." There was a moment of resistance, then a sigh, then a nod. She read the passage, steady, strong, not to show off, not to take over, but so Elijah wouldn't have to bear the weight of proving his worth in front of a room waiting to judge his volume. And when she finished, she looked at him. He smiled, just barely. But it was enough. By the time spring arrived, nothing around her looked that different. The school walls were still painted the same dull shade of beige, the lunch menu still rotated through soggy pizza and undercooked broccoli, and the same students still fought for spots near the back of the bus. But something in the air had shifted, and this time, it wasn't just in her. There was a new bulletin board in the main hallway titled Voices That Matter. But what mattered more was who was missing from it. There were names, yes, posters of students who led fundraisers, who won science fairs, who ran track meets. But her name, her face, not there, and yet she smiled, because she had never needed permission to matter. She had learned that being visible wasn't the same as being valued, and that silence, when chosen, could be a form of control. But when forced, it was erasure, and she would never be erased again. Elijah had started speaking up in class. Naomi had joined the debate team. 3 students had written anonymous essays for the school paper about coded language and racial expectations in the classroom. She hadn't written any of them, but she had written all of them, through every word she'd once been told not to say. Her mother noticed, too, not in anything big, but in the way she listened when her daughter spoke, really listened, as if the girl sitting at her kitchen table wasn't just her child, but a mirror of every time she had been silenced in her own girlhood. The last day of school came. Yearbooks passed, shirts signed, halls echoed with the joy of escape. But she didn't feel like she was leaving something behind. She felt like she had carved a path, not for applause, but so others wouldn't have to trip over the same stones. When she walked out of that school building for the last time that year, she didn't slam the door. She didn't make a speech. She didn't even look back. She just walked forward, head high, steps quiet, presence louder than ever. Because the truth was never in how loud she spoke. It was in the fact that they finally had to listen. If this story stirred something in you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the ones that come next. Every voice deserves to be heard. The next one might be yours.